Good morning. I'm Kristen Balasia, Head of Automotive Advisory at IHS Markit, and welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. Today, I'm happy to be joined by my colleagues Tim Armstrong, Senior Vice President of Research and Analysis, and Tom Vleesschauwer, Executive Director, Mobility Planning. Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi, Kristen. Nice to be here.
Good morning, Kristen. Happy to be here too.
Today, we're going to be talking about CERAWeek, which is widely considered to be the most prestigious annual gathering of the global energy community. And over recent years, has really become an increasingly relevant and important event for automotive and technology players. CERAWeek also brings in leaders and discussions across the utility, manufacturing, policy, and financial communities. This year, albeit in a virtual format, marked its 39th anniversary. So Tim, why don't we start with you providing an overview on the importance of CERAWeek with a focus on the automotive sector and some relevant speakers and attendees that we had this year that make it really a powerful event for the automotive industry.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. As you say, it's been around for nearly 40 years, and hasn't the world changed a lot in that period? It started out really as a focal point for the energy industry, and one of the main attractions of CERAWeek has been its convening power. To some extent, it's really seen as the Davos for energy. Over a number of years then, you had many senior people from the energy and government space coming together to talk about the topics of the day. But the world has moved on. Certainly, the use of energy in the global economy has shifted significantly with the rise of countries like China, India, and so forth. And the way energy is used, and of course the cleanness, the carbon level that energy emits, has become much more of a central focus. So as that has shifted, and as we have governments signing up to Paris Accord and so forth, so too has the focus of CERAWeek shifted in accordance. And broadly speaking, now we see CERAWeek shift away from fossil fuels. It's obviously still part of the discussion, but much more concerned with the use of energy in the global economy, which sectors and industries are using that that energy, and what is their path to decarbonization. So the last 2, 3, 4 years, we've seen the rise of a discussion around transportation as one of the main energy emitters, if you like, from in the global economy. And of course, transportation and transport decarbonization is very much part of the climate change discussion and the legislation that's following on from that. So the auto sector and the technology sector has really come to play a significant role in CERAWeek in recent years. Lots of discussion then on the role that transport is playing, the level of electrification in transport and its role in a decarbonizing world, the role that the government will play in the right policies for that. What role will the energy sector, of course, play, whether it's upstream or downstream? What role will finance and technology and innovation play in that equation? And so CERAWeek has been really one of the only locations that you can bring together all of the players that can discuss that question, be it government, or be it the energy industry, or be it technology, or be it the automotive community. And we've seen that really grow in scale, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, to the point where we have some really strong leaders in the automotive sector participating. So in the last couple of years, we've had Mary Barra from GM, we've had Bill Ford Jr. from Ford, of course. This year, we had Bill Gates talking to Dan Yergin about the role of technology and innovation in meeting the net zero obligations, and what is required to measure that and to move down that path and over what period. And those are very powerful discussions that are being having within the CERAWeek community. So from that perspective, it's becoming much more a cross-industry event, attracting a very high level of discussion about how do we collectively meet some of these challenges.
And Tom, further along those lines of the broadening scope of CERAWeek, one of the major topics for discussion this year was mobility transition. And that in itself is a pretty broad topic covering technologies, consumers, changes to the infrastructure. What are the most critical aspects to that transition and that we're experiencing right now?
Well, it is indeed quite a big hefty topic there, and it makes you wonder, where can we start on this? Well, why don't we start at some of the learnings that we've had over the duration of CERAWeek from this. We hosted quite a few panel discussions ourselves there with a variety of different stakeholders. And I think one of the things that we learned, and let's start with the beginning here, is that for the current year, we know last year, the pandemic caused quite a bit of a dip in the global mobility market overall. But we did get the feeling this time, talking to these stakeholders, that the sentiment is becoming much more positive, and demand is kind of starting to gradually return to pre-pandemic levels. I don't think we're going to get fully there yet. At least not based on some of the comments from, say, like Lyft, who were there with us on one of the panel discussions. Now, there's a bit less optimism when we're looking about, say, public transit. I think public transit is really kind of expected to still kind of lag behind a little bit, and particularly in terms of like the passenger kilometers. Many passengers around the world have kind of sort of being untrusting of sharing, quite a big space with a lot of other people where you don't even know where they've been, if they've been infected or not, and that is really kind of holding it back. And I think particularly if we're looking at some of the larger cities with big public transit systems, like be it New York, be it London, or even Tokyo, the operators of those public transit systems are all suffering. They're basically bleeding cash. And in many cases, particularly in London, and I think in New York as well, they're having to go cap in hand, back to their respective, like local or national governments, trying to plead to get some more funding to just keep it going and provide what is really seen as an essential service there. So that is still kind of brewing away there within the wider system. But on the one hand, we've seen that the bigger winner of this has really been sort of the personally owned car. And that's sort of maybe a little bit contradicting to, what we've seen with all this new mobility revolution, where it was all about, like we don't want ownership, particularly the younger generation. And now we've actually seen in the last year or so that, the younger generation who were first shunning away from owning a car were now actively shopping for a new car. And we saw that the markets recovered quite well, particularly in the US and in China, very strongly there too. So it was twofold. People were trying to avoid having to take any forms of sort of public transportation, because that would be perceived as it's kind of dangerous, and people were all longing to have their own vehicle. Lyft was also suggesting that. A bit more forward-looking, the robo-taxi or the autonomous vehicle technology that they're testing with is clearly representing a major growth opportunity for them in the future. But when we pushed them a little bit further, they kind of admitted, well, it's still a few years away. And I think a few years away, it might potentially still be a little bit optimistic there. But it's nice to have an honest view from them, at least in the sense. And so in the interim, one of the aspects that these mobility operators were really embracing is that growth opportunity for micromobility, and particularly during the pandemic, and Lyft and other operators that we had there were specifically mentioning e-bikes as being one of the big success stories of the pandemic. People can enjoy the outdoors, have more air around. So it's perceived as a safer option from that. Moving on from that, I think, we have seen, Tim's already alluded to it, these new kind of climate targets, net zero ambitions have also been starting to be felt on the transportation side, on the mobility side. And I think one of the best examples, GM, announcing their 100% ZEF self-mandate. They've been followed since by Ford of Europe doing the same thing for passenger cars. Volvo has come out. I mean, many others. And I think today, globally, we're probably at about almost like 19 vehicle brands that have made a self-mandate in terms of we want to go 100% ZEF. And that's, of course, a very big ambition, particularly for vehicle manufacturers, is going to have a huge impact across the whole supply chain. And that's why I think these mobility service providers, be they, Uber, Lyft, or Didi, for them it's a little bit easier. And I suspect that they will be the first to sort of, unlock these opportunities here. And very interestingly, listening to them, their customers are actually asking, like, we would like to have an electric vehicle, and they're even willing to pay a little bit more for it. So it's, the price premium of having access to an electric vehicle in a ride hailing or in a car sharing business is a lot less for consumers than if you would have to buy outright right now today your own electric vehicle. So that's not seen as kind of an impediment there to that take up. So, but overall, I think the shared vehicles or shared mobility is something that really will help quite well with the cost management from their perspective, and of course also energy management, and that's becoming much more critical with these emission regulations, fuel efficiency regulations, and in having an EV or a fuel cell vehicle for that matter, really can almost unlock savings of up to 50% per mile for these mobility service companies. So it's really seen as kind of a very essential part of their business moving forward in that transition. And I was particularly pleased to hear that the representative from Lyft that was with us, he was referring or defining as mobility, in essence, we're moving people from one place to another, utilizing energy. So, I mean, already there in that mindset from them, they're no longer just looking at it like this is a vehicle that we have, and we need to put out. No, they're realizing, we're moving people, or it could be things, it could be, food deliveries or parcel deliveries, and we need energy for that. So I think that is starting to unlock that transition, even though it is this mobility transition. We are increasingly dependent on people outside of our own comfort center, basically, that we have historically been in this industry. A second part to that is really that these mobility companies are also kind of increasingly, as they were talking to us about it, expecting that there is more a move happening towards a human-centered city. So we're really looking at this kind of trend that started arguably, with that pandemic again, where, streets were cordoned off or closed off, to traffic. People were walking, cycling on those. We've seen the rise of these parklets, where we're converting these like roadside parking spaces and transforming them really in a community space, which again is an opportunity to generate more revenue for the local community. And I think that those are sort of the first step as part of that transition. And Lyft was arguing that actually, the city belongs to people first and cars second. Very big commitment there from them. But I think they're saying that that transition has now started in earnest, and really like hoping to see as a next step that dedicated mobility lanes would be created in our future cities, so we can really start sort of that next trajectory then, and really almost like reinventing the city itself and how people move about in there. But I think that's still quite some years away from that. And then finally, we heard also from several stakeholders in the vehicle powertrain sector, and really what we heard there was that yes, we have this, future propulsion systems. There's a lot of sort of perceived competition within there. We heard a lot of discussion about, fuel cell vehicles and battery electric vehicles. But really, what we also learned is that, these vehicles, there is a market application, specific market application for both of those technologies. So it looks like, there's not going to be a single winner out there in the first place. And of course, the charging infrastructure providers were very well represented also. And, with all the debates we had there, it's really about sort of like looking that the key here is really going to be, providing charging solutions that are the right for the local markets that they need to serve. And that means also, the location and the energy source itself, and how clean is that energy source. So it's a long answer here. I think I could go on for quite a little bit longer, but I'll hand it back to you, Kristen.
I bet you could, but that was a really good segue, and you touched on a lot of things there. My takeaways were, I can't wait for a parklet to come near me soon, and the costs, right? So you talked a lot about things that, through this mobility transition, maybe there's been, at the expense of public transportation or some other areas. But one of our attendees or participants of CERAWeek, U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, she stated that this net zero economy by 2050 could actually generate about $23 trillion US dollars, and put the full force and support of the US behind that, behind EVs and battery development and things like that. So Tim, another area, when it comes to the costs and the revenue generation that we discussed, was the speed at which some of these changes are expected, based on these, lofty stated regulations with a change in administration in the U.S. These, like one of you mentioned, the product and technology announcements coming out of the industry. This is not, free or easy. It requires some massive investment. So, in what ways is the industry addressing that challenge?
Yes, as you say, 2050 sounds like it's a long way away, but when you think of the amount of decarbonisation that needs to take place, it's just around the corner, and the challenge is pretty significant. For example, the US and Europe roughly have each about 30% of emissions coming from their CO2 emissions coming from the transport sector. So it's a big contributor. Think about then, the lifespan of a typical autos OEM platform, perhaps 10 to 12 years, and a powertrain platform is typically longer than that. And so you've really only got one or two iterations of investment before you have to have essentially a completely decarbonized automotive industry. So it is coming much faster than perhaps the wider community is aware in terms of the upfront investment that's required. What we heard at CERAWeek particularly was the overall framework is being more and more driven by government legislation. We have the umbrella legislation, if you like, of the Paris Accord, driving it to 2050. And then we have other pieces of legislation coming in under that. And we, of course, had Joe Biden signing up back again to the COP21 agreement within a few days of coming into office. So that provides the framework, but then each jurisdiction, the US, Europe, China, has multiple and different types of legislation. I think there are perhaps 10 or 15 pieces of legislation related to this that need to kind of come together and work together for Europe to really measure its contribution, whereas it's much more holistically laid out within China, for example, as part of an overall framework. So government legislation is important, and involvement, and will continue to drive this and has to drive it. Increasingly, that'll be around things like life cycle analysis, where you can understand the embedding of CO2 across the whole manufacturing chain and the fuel cycle. So you're not just measuring tank to wheel, but you're measuring it through the entire industrial process. And I think that's going to be a very important driver. The second piece, of course, is the technologies. Technologies are typically well understood. We know how to build hybrid vehicles and pure battery electric. The technologies will improve, but they're well understood. So that's a path that I think the industry is on pretty clearly. The third piece, of course, is the consumer, and that's perhaps the least well understood as to when this take-up will occur and the scale of that. And the OEMs are making some pretty bold statements about how they are going to adopt the legislation. So we're actually seeing the OEMs preempt the consumer to some extent and announce these intentions to decarbonize even before the consumer has really voted with their feet in terms of being able to or willing to take up the levels of demand that is going to be required. So that's a kind of interesting, almost a reversal, if you like, but it really demonstrates the combined intent globally to go down this path.
So, Tom, not only are the OEMs and policymakers having to drive this change and transform, but the suppliers and others, in the supply chain, oil and gas, are having to transform and reposition themselves as well. Can you share some of what was discussed at CERAWeek as it relates to the wider mobility ecosystem, maybe in the supplier community?
Sure. We had the benefit of having quite a wide exposure to the supply community there, and just maybe a few like 2 or 3 points I'll quickly touch upon. we have to look at the wider overall system here. And we were fortunate to have a very senior representative of ThyssenKrupp Steel, so a large steel company. And they're obviously very much, at the core of one of those sectors that will be very heavily affected by this. But it was fascinating to hear that from their perspective, even if we clean up their steel, we have to do it anyway, even if there is an EV or none. An electric vehicle still needs steel in order, to make that vehicle and to have it on the road. There's no difference. And I thought that was quite very interesting. And they really kind of kept stressing on the fact that, we cannot afford to look at it in isolation, from other stakeholders. We really have to see this as a system approach, throughout the entire value chain. And I think that's what the automotive community kind of needs to start embracing, really. We also heard from Amazon, one of the tech leaders here, who, they're talking about, okay, good, we can help to enable the autonomous vehicles. They will be transmitting huge amounts of data. You need some cloud storage for that. They can provide that. But of course, these data centers, they require a lot of energy to operate. So at the end of the day, that robotaxi might perhaps not be as climate friendly as we originally thought. Again, we need that cooperation. And finally, we had the CEO of BP, the large energy giant, and he kind of really saying that, look, we realized, over the last few years that actually, we're almost becoming like a mobility integrated company here. Because we are as much affected by all of this and touching upon that mobility side. And I think that's really kind of exactly kind of sort of the mindset, that we need to have. And I think that kind of really frames it very well, really, that the automotive industry maybe needs to be a little bit more sort of like open-minded and look beyond our traditional boundaries.
So final question for each of you. And Tim, why don't we start with you? What was the most critical or exciting takeaway that you had for the auto industry, for maybe those that weren't able to attend?
I think it's quickly said, difficult to achieve, that it's going to be something that plays out. This decarbonization will play out over the long term. It's incredibly complex because you need to bring in all of these stakeholders, and these are stakeholders that we find at CERAWeek, but that it is inevitable, and that getting to grips with it up front is only going to make it easier than putting it off. Great.
Thanks, Tim. Tom, what about you?
Well, it's I would say that the interesting thing is that again, if you're there, attending CERAWeek, it was virtual this time, but if you're in person there next year, so much more exciting. You can really feel that kind of sense of commitment across those many different stakeholders, in different industry sectors. And it really kind of highlights it to people that, look, we're not in this on our own. This is not just an auto challenge. We're sharing this burden with other industry sectors. And of course, when you're there, you can make some friends and really meet people that you wouldn't meet normally, at auto events or when you're just sitting in your office.
Right. No, great points, both of you. Thank you, Tim and Tom, so much for joining this episode of Fuel for Thought. We'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt into our newsletter that provides more information on CERAWeek 2021 and others, please visit ihsmarkit.com/auto newsletter.